Welcome to the Nduranz podcast. In this episode, we deep dive into a latest publication by Dr. Tim Noakes, which has caused some controversy in the sport and exercise nutrition world. It suggests that 10 grams an hour of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise is sufficient for endurance performance. We discuss some of the key points of this research paper. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Nduranz podcast, where we dive into the science, the strategies, and the stories behind endurance performance. I'm your host, Alex Rhodes, and with me, as always, Dr. Tim Podloga. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Alex.
How are you?
Excited to talk about today's topic, I think.
Yeah, so today for the listeners, we're actually going to be reviewing a piece of research that has recently been published by an infamous researcher, Dr. Tim Noakes, who is well known not only for his research output, but also for some of the controversial side of his research as well. And the latest publication has caused a little bit of a backlash in the sport and exercise nutrition world. So I'm just going to read the title straight off so you listeners out there can understand what we're about to talk about. And then I'm just going to give their summary of the research paper so that, again, it leads into the topics that we are going to talk about. So the title of this publication is Carbohydrate Ingestion on Exercise Metabolism and Physical Performance. And their summary as part of their conclusion of this paper is that the data reviewed herein presents a novel interpretation that nutritional strategies to maximize performance during prolonged exercise should be geared to maintaining the small glucose pool during exercise rather than filling or overfilling the large glucose pool before exercise. The present evidence indicates that this can be achieved by ingesting relatively small amounts of carbohydrates, approximately 10 grams during exercise. And of course, you can imagine this has caused both sides of the camp. The low carbers are promoting this, saying that the research that's been carried out in the past has not been interpreted correct. And we've got the side of the high carbohydrates as well, who are refuting some of these claims. Now, we wanted to give our review of this paper and try and highlight some of the important parts and break it down so we can understand a little bit more about where the research is coming from. So I suppose, first of all, Tim, what's your view on not only your overall perspective of this publication, but also the kind of reaction that we've seen from social media as well?
I mean, it's not unexpected from Tim and his colleagues who can actually come up with something like this, given that the whole career of Professor Tim Noakes has been challenging beliefs, as is also the title of his book that was published, 15 years ago or so. And the whole history behind his work has always been about trying to figure out ways where we are wrong in terms of interpretation of the evidence. It all started with the fatigue mechanisms and VO2max. Then he did a lot of work in the field of carbohydrate metabolism, whereas to see how important carbohydrates are, and that story concluded with carbohydrates are important. That was in the late 90s, early 2000s. Then he progressed towards the hydration myths, saying that hydration to thirst is sufficient, that we shouldn't be thinking about adding electrolytes during exercise or adding loads of fluids, because it actually can turn into problems, kind of like intoxication with water, or however it is called. And then his last episodes of challenging the beliefs is that carbohydrates are not essential for performance, that carbohydrates are actually causing athletes to become insulin resistant at some point during their careers or after that, and that is a big challenge for the health of the athletes. So this is kind of the last article. So it's a literature review. It's a narrative literature review. It means that it's written in a way that it builds a story rather than like systematically reviews the literature. It's a very comprehensive piece of work, more than 50 pages. It kind of reads almost like a book. Has more than 600 references. And the interesting part of it all is that like these 600 references include all of studies by Professor Asker Jokendrup, all the studies by Louise Berg, all the studies by Gareth Wallis, all the studies produced by me, claiming that this is the evidence suggesting that carbohydrates are not as essential, even though the conclusions of all these studies is pretty much carbohydrates are important. So he somehow, or their group somehow, interpret all the available evidence as saying carbohydrates are not as important as we previously thought.
So I think there's some key things there actually to slightly take a step back. You know, they have included, you know, a vast amount of very credible research in there. But for some of the listeners here who are perhaps not, I suppose, versed in reviewing literature and the likes, you highlighted a great point there that this is a narrative review. And there are different other types of reviews, like a systematic review, whereby there's a process and a process of elimination depending on your certain criteria. You know, what are, I suppose, the downfalls of the differences between a narrative and a more systematic approach to this?
So we can go to the start of types of publications we have out there. So all the research is based on original research studies. These are the studies that actually recruit participants or do experiments in the laboratory. And then based on that, we get a paper that is kind of called original research article. Then the next topic is, once we have a plethora of research papers, we start thinking, how do we actually combine the knowledge we obtain during these individual pieces into like one big piece of evidence? And this is when we start talking about reviews. So we have kind of, I see three types of kind of publications in this in this scheme, or let's call it four types. First one would be like a perspective or current opinion, which is kind of very biased, or like as the title suggests, an idea is being presented based on the evidence we have. Then we have the next piece is like a narrative review, as is the case in here, where it's kind of the authors, usually experts in the field, are given kind of a free access or like an opportunity to present in their view what actually the research is supposed to be. Most of the time, these narrative reviews should be relatively unbiased, should include all the references, should include, should basically show the point that actually reflects what actually the literature shows. It's peer-reviewed, and the idea is that it's kind of accurate representation of the evidence. However, there are no sets of rules in here, so like authors has a lot of freedom on how they actually structure the article. Then we have systematic reviews, and then systematic reviews with meta-analysis. So systematic review already follows some guidelines, has a really strict procedure on how articles are searched for, how they interpreted, and that kind of leads to very strong and unbiased conclusions. And then we have meta-analysis, which is kind of pulling the studies together and perform actually the statistical analysis of on the results of these studies. So this is kind of in brief. So narrative review should be unbiased, which is kind of what's supposed to be the case in here. It undergoes strict or should undergo strict peer review. So that means that other researchers in the field anonymously usually review the article and say whether this actually is the representation of the current state of literature or not, and suggest improvements. Clearly, at least in my opinion and opinion of many others, this has not happened in the publication of the present article because there are so many people like me that disagree with the content of the article.
Yeah, and I think, just that is an important point there, is that there is no strict procedure in doing this. And we're not saying that the content that's included is not valid and not important with regards to this, but they have their own selection of studies. There's no set inclusion or exclusion criteria based on what they're trying to do. So I think that's an important part going into some of these. And I get the pedantic things over to start with, but some things again is important when we are assessing research, and in this case we're talking about endurance performance here. And fatigue. And I think, if you care to explain, Tim, there are some, what is endurance performance? Because we know that can come in many different forms. Time to exhaustion, a certain percentage of VO2 max or lactate threshold, repeatability of higher intensities, intermittent surges, the types of profiles that we see in bike racing or different types of running and other types of event can be also classed as endurance performance. So what things do we need to be careful with when we're looking at these types of studies?
I think measuring performance in the lab is the hardest thing ever, because it's really, really difficult to, in controlled situation, that you get athletes to actually push as fast, as much as they could, and that you get like a representation of the outdoor race, for example. For instance, just to give an example, if you look at the power profile during cycling races or even triathlon races, you see that it's kind of non-uniform. It keeps changing, it's undulating, there are climbs, there are descents, there are sprints, there are, just pauses in the power. Whereas when we are talking about the lab, we usually have everything very controlled, very repeatable. So the next time the person comes to the lab, it's the same, at least part of it. And that means that we usually use like steady state exercise on ergometers. And this obviously has implications on how we actually get the results and what they actually mean. And another thing that we like to do in metabolism research, and has been historically the kind of the main type of performance performance test, is time to exhaustion at relatively moderately intensity exercise. So if we look at what moderate intensity exercise is, it's usually below the first lactate threshold, and you go for as long as you can until fatigue. It's been proven to kind of demonstrate really nicely what nutrition strategies, what training strategies, what any other strategies like environmental factors, how they work and affect time to exhaustion in this case. It's very controlled, and you can have like the same kind of procedures up until the point of fatigue. You take a biopsy at the end, for example, and you have like everything is very quantifiable. But the problem with this is that no race actually in the real world looks like that you have time to exhaustion. Some people argue, and that rightly so, that for instance, when Tadej Pogačar attacks on a climb and Remco Evenepoel tries to follow, it's a time to exhaustion effort for Remco, whether he can follow or for as long as he can follow Tadej Pogačar on the climb. But the difference here is that we're talking about completely different exercise intensity. So we're talking about high intensity exercise in the severe exercise intensity domain, rather than moderately trained exercise intensity. And I think these are things that we need to be really careful about when we try to interpret research and apply the knowledge into the real world scenarios.
And indeed, your example there, comes after 3-4 hours already in the saddle, which has, there's surges within the peloton and changes there as well. So, there's a lot of factors that are going to play a part in that end result, which again, that comes down to what is performance at the end of the day. And just jumping back to this, so their hypothesis was that it was blood glucose that is responsible for causing fatigue and not muscle glycogen. Now, again, this will be the final pedantic point before we get into some of the details of the paper. But again, what is fatigue? Because that itself is quite a complex situation. I don't think we fully understand some of the mechanisms behind fatigue, and also that might be situational, as we've just discussed. If we see in the applied side of things, there are different things that could cause that. Do you want to give us your thought on how we should think about interpreting fatigue out in the field, but also, how that might look within, a research lab setting?
I mean, we usually define fatigue as central or peripheral. So central means that it's at the brain level, or like above the spine, let's call it that way. So that it's basically the brain saying like, no, you can't exercise anymore and you fatigue at some point. And we will discuss a little bit about that later on, I think. And then you have peripheral fatigue. This is when you're talking about actually the muscle that cannot do anymore. So what we usually, or in the lab, researchers do to actually see which type of fatigue it is. So if you, let's say, do exercise and your performance declines, so your power output eventually declines, you can then differentiate whether it's a peripheral or a central fatigue by simply using the electrical stimulation. So if you stimulate the muscle itself, and if the muscle is still behaving the same way as it was behaving before fatiguing exercise, this means that it's the brain or the central system that is preventing the muscle to be working at a full capacity. On the other hand side, if the muscle is simply, even with the muscle electrical stimulation, not responding the same way and that has reduced ability to produce force, then we're talking about peripheral fatigue. So the brain can you can keep trying to exercise at the same intensity, but simply the muscle will say no to it. So that's kind of the distinction between central and peripheral fatigue. And there are many different kind of theories what the cause is. And Tim Noakes has its own theory, has been promoting one of the theories for ages. It's called the central governor theory of fatigue, which kind of postulates that there is a part of the brain that kind of is the main mechanism for inducing fatigue. And it kind of says that it's a preventative mechanism to prevent severe depletion of ATP, so the energy in the muscle, because if there is a severe depletion of ATP or energy in the muscle goes into rigor mortis, which means that you basically get a dead, stiff body, which we never pretty much do during exercise.
It sometimes feels like that.
Well, yeah. Maybe.
No, so I mean, again, I think this is where some of the not the controversy, but some of the pushback against this is that we're right in saying that there are multiple studies on both sides saying that yes, if blood glucose level does decline, fatigue occurs, but also there are studies to say that if muscle glycogen status declines, that can also impact time to exhaustion in this. So what they're trying to say from this paper is that we're replacing just one of those factors as being the main cause of fatigue, when actually it can be quite multifactorial and depends on the context of how we're seeing it. Am I right by saying that?
Yeah, exactly. I think if we go point by point in their discussion, we can then perhaps address the points individually, and I'll try to explain that kind of the problems with their reasoning.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the steps that we were going to go into next. So we're going to just break down at the end of this paper. As Tim mentioned, there's about 53 pages to this paper. So we're not going to dive in page by page. They have 16 points at the end. Again, we're not going to go through all because some are related to each other, but we're going to go through their key points and discuss them because, you know, it's important to highlight some strengths and some things that we believe are correct, but also any points of discussion, disagreement is also an important part, and it will hopefully convey some information out there around this publication. So I'm going to just start up at the first point that they're making. I'm going to try and paraphrase some of these because some of them are quite long and do have some scientific language in them. So hopefully I will be able to convey the right point, and then we'll get your view, Tim, and we can have a discussion about what that might mean. So the first point is the mechanism of depletion of the large skeletal muscle glucose pool causes fatigue remains hypothetical. The usual explanation is that the TAT, which is the provision of substrate to the mitochondria and the Krebs cycle, which postulates that muscle glycogen depletion during exercise causes an inevitable energy crisis. But this is implausible since a developing energy crisis must produce skeletal ATP depletion, leading to ultimately muscle rigor, not whole body fatigue. But this does not happen. A more probable explanation is that exercise fatigue is a brain control mechanism designed to cause exercise termination before irreversible energy depletion occurs in the exercising skeletal muscle. That was quite a mouthful, but do you want to give us your take on that, Tim?
Yeah, I think here is already sets the problem of the whole reasoning that follows later on. And if we go to start with what we discussed earlier, so we have peripheral and central fatigue. So if their reasoning is correct, it's only central fatigue that exists, but not peripheral. So peripheral fatigue is completely ignored here, but we know we can basically skip the brain fatigue by simply doing the muscle stimulation. And by doing muscle stimulation, we know that muscle on its own, on a dish, let's call it outside the body, can actually fatigue. So we know that it can actually fatigue without developing rigor mortis. And there are mechanisms within the skeletal muscle that prevent rigor mortis or depletion of ATP to actually occur. So if we look at the energy stores, what we have in the muscle available immediately is obviously the ATP, which is kind of made to be constant. So the supply of ATP or the concentrations of ATP in the muscle are very, very protected. They do not decline. What does decline is, for instance, the substrates that we use to produce ATP. So we have creatine phosphate system. That's why people are eating creatine. So that's kind of the immediate energy system that releases energy to actually produce more ATP molecules. Then we have glycogen, which can be anaerobically used to produce, again, energy that we can use to supply ATP. Then we have fats. That are some of them in the muscle. We need oxygen for that to basically oxidize fats. And then we have the supply of, by the blood, both the carbohydrates or the fats, and obviously also the oxygen. So if we take away the supply of oxygen and the supply of glucose to the muscle would eventually fatigue, and that would not lead to a rigor mortis. Why would it fatigue, and how would fatigue look like? We would start to accumulate certain products like hydrogen ions and inorganic phosphate. These both would impair basically the cycling of the calcium, would impair the way how we contract, and the muscle will fatigue without developing rigor mortis or reducing the ATP supply. So there are kind of before the actual muscle contraction, immediate muscle contraction, the muscle would fatigue before that. So meaning, in other words, it's not just, the supply of ATP. So like I think the mechanism of fatigue are way more complex, and there are mechanisms within the muscle that prevent rigor mortis to occur. When it comes to kind of like glycogen and glycogen availability and evidence for development of muscle fatigue. So if we think about what happens when the supply of carbohydrates, but then like just talk about carbohydrates as the supply of glucose and the glycogen diminishes, it gets reduced, we would be only relying on the availability of fatty acids. That of course can provide us with plenty of energy, because the mitochondria as the powerhouses of energy can also use fatty acids for energy. What we are losing is the capacity to use glycolysis. So this kind of high energy or like, let's say anaerobic energy production. And that is highly limited once we reduce the capacity of the muscle to actually have glycogen in it, because we start to rely on the supply from the bloodstream, and the supply from the bloodstream of glucose is always lower than what we can actually oxidize or use during exercise. Just to give you an example, if you're riding at like, let's say 300 watts, you will likely be oxidizing at every single time around 3 grams of carbohydrates per minute, even though fat oxidation at this intensity would be around 0.8 to 1 gram per minute, depending on an athlete probably. But 3 grams per minute of carbohydrates cannot be met by supplying carbohydrates through the bloodstream. You need to be using glycogen within the muscle. Once the supply of carbohydrates is diminished, you pretty much need to either upregulate fat supply or fat oxidation, which does not really happen at that capacity, or you fatigue. And I think that evidence for that is pretty strong, that even though you still can have blood glucose concentrations to be kind of normal, the muscle or your capacity to do the work would actually get reduced with low muscle glycogen concentrations.
And I think that applying that context is important. If you said there is like, what is the fatigue here? Because if we're at 300 watts, which might be quite high, quite severe for an individual, actually fatigue is just not being able to hold 300 watts. And should we reduce to 200 watts, you can continue. Versus if you're moderate to low, very low, the capacity will probably happen a long, long time. And whether we've really tested that is interesting as well. So it's where that fatigue mechanism occurs. Is it at a higher intensity? Is probably limited by some of those substrates in the muscle.
Yeah, indeed.
So I'm going to group the second, third, and fourth points together, because they probably discuss similar things around the maintenance of glycemia, so blood glucose levels. So I'm just going to read them out, and then we'll discuss them as we just have. So point 2, the iconic 1967 Scandinavian study failed to acknowledge that individuals eating carbohydrate-restricted diets terminated exercise, not with low muscle glycogen content alone, but with also markers of exercise-induced hypoglycemia, so low blood sugar levels. The third point, early studies by Boge, Christiansen, and Hansen showing that carbohydrate ingestion could reverse exhaustion in individuals during prolonged exercise concluded that fatigue must be regarded as a hypoglycemic symptom of the cerebral origin. And my final point, which is point 4 in the study, is a series of carefully conducted studies in the 1980s concluded that Boge, Christiansen, and Hansen's interpretation was incorrect. postulating rather that carbohydrate ingestion prolongs exercise, not by preventing or reversing exercise-induced hypoglycemia, but by providing an obligatory exogenous source of carbohydrates for muscles that have become glycogen depleted during prolonged exercise. However, none of these new studies provided definitive evidence to support this replacement hypothesis, which currently remains unproven and largely untested with little or no experimental support. What do you say to that, Tim?
So pretty much saying it's the blood glucose that kind of is the most important. So when we talk about blood glucose, we're talking about, the glucose that you measure when you go to the doctors and they tell you, well, your blood glucose levels are normal, which is in the range probably between 4 and let's say 5.5 millimoles per liter. And if you go lower, so you become hypoglycemic, blood glucose concentrations decline, you basically don't feel well, and during exercise you're obviously fatigued. And one of the things that you see in many of these low intensity time to exhaustion trials in studies is that blood glucose declines or is low when fatigue actually occurs. So when participants stop, this also indicates that when their blood glucose supply runs out. And what kind of their idea is that we know that with increasing glycogen stores, you can probably prolong when this decline in blood glucose concentrations occur. So this means that it's blood glucose concentration, not glycogen per se, that is prolonging the exercise. And in those original studies, usually people did not have carbohydrates ingested during exercise, so blood glucose levels were not protected. But if we look at the evidence when they actually had carbohydrates during exercise and blood glucose levels were protected, that meant that fatigue did not occur and that glycogen levels did not have any effect. I agree with the point that blood glucose concentrations are very important and are probably crucial for maintaining the normal function of the human body. The problem is that, and we will discuss this I think already also later, at higher intensities, blood glucose concentrations can remain normal or be even elevated, but fatigue would still occur. So I think there is nothing wrong, and I think the blood glucose concentrations are really important, and it's something the body really tries to protect because we have many mechanisms, including creating new glucose molecules from precursors like amino acids or glycerol to basically prevent this from happening. And when it does happen, you basically need to stop. So I think that this is the right point they are making in this case, but I don't think the way how it's kind of interpreted later on or in this section actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've all been there if we train regularly, where we have not fueled or we've hit the wall, or we've bonked as the word would be, and we can stop, we can take a gel, we can get some sugar back in us, and actually within a short period we can restore that feeling and actually continue to ride as well. So I think it's an important point to say that it is important, but also acknowledge that that's not necessarily the only thing and how those studies might have been conducted. A final one on, I'm going to skip point 5 because that is a very similar point to what we've just discussed. Point 6, again, is around blood glucose concentration. I'm going to go through it, and if you have any additional comments to this, Tim, then we could quickly pass those before we go on to the next points. But point 6 is the neural mechanisms by which failing blood glucose concentrations limit the recruitment of skeletal muscle motor units to prevent the risk of glycopenic brain damage is well described. The biological effect of hypoglycemia on exercise performance must be considered relatively to an individual's baseline glucose levels and magnitude of glucose reduction, as counter-regulatory responses and symptoms vary by person. It can occur sub-perceptually and may manifest at higher glucose levels in those with chronically elevated glycemia. Consequently, the drop in blood glucose relative to the prior value has important biological consequences in exercise performance beyond the absolute value of blood glucose. So they're saying really the change in blood glucose drop is important rather than the absolute value, say you get below 3.5 millimole.
I mean, here already kind of shows like a bit of a flaw in their thinking, which is like we're looking at blood glucose. Where are we measuring blood glucose? Are we looking at the venous blood glucose? Are we talking about arterialized blood glucose? Are we talking about blood glucose in the arterioles leading to the brain? Are we talking about muscle? Where is this and where do actually studies measure it? Because usually in the studies we looked at the arterialized venous blood, which could not be perhaps representative of what is happening in the brain, I don't know. And the most important thing, which they do not mention I think once in the article, is actually glucose flux, which is way more important. So basically when we look at just concentrations, that's just not representative. We need to have flux. If we look at for example, a good example to actually imagine this is that during exercise, if we look me or today Pogacar, we would both get the oxygen into the bloodstream. We would both have the saturation of oxygen almost at 100%, but at the same kind of maximal relative exercise intensity, his VO2 max would be in the 90s and mine would be in the 60s, just because there is more flux of oxygen coming to the muscles because there are more red blood cells. So it's just part of the equation. We're talking about blood glucose concentrations. We need to talk also about actually how much glucose actually gets delivered to the muscle, not just concentration. We're talking about then what we are missing is blood flow, not just concentration, and then how much glucose actually leaves the bloodstream and goes into the brain or goes into the muscle. And I think this is something they kind of ignore and could be really important for interpretation, because flux is really important. And we know, for example, when you are feeding 90 grams per hour or when you're feeding 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, you will have very similar blood glucose concentrations, but extraction or flux would be very different, because you would see higher oxidation rates of ingested carbohydrates with 90 versus 60 grams per hour, for example, with very similar blood glucose concentrations.
And is that very similar in relation to one of your recent studies where you looked at oxidation rates versus dose, where actually the absolute uptake or oxidation was greater, even though the relative percentage was a little bit lower?
Yeah, I think this is like something needs to be really better explained. This is kind of the flaws they have in their argumentation and then become problematic for the understanding of the whole story. At first it reads really nicely, but then you see these flaws and they're like, oh, actually.
Right, point 7. Increasing the amount of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise increases the rate of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. According to the novel replacement theory, this additional source of obligatory carbohydrate should produce an easily detectable dose-dependent increase in exercise performance. However, studies of progressively higher rates of carbohydrate ingestion during prolonged exercise failed to show serial dose-dependent improvements in exercise performance. Rather, the lowest carbohydrate dose that is tested usually produces ergogenic effects equivalent to those produced at much higher rates of carbohydrate higher rates of carbohydrate ingestion. This effect is most logically explained by the carbohydrate acting to prevent depletion of the small glucose pool in the blood and liver, rather than by depletion of the large glucose pool in the skeletal muscle. So basically they're saying we don't see changes in performance based on how much carbohydrates you take in exogenously, so during exercise.
Well, I think this is very their own interpretation of the evidence, and we have evidence suggesting that probably the sweet spot for prolonged endurance exercise in terms of performance in moderately trained individuals is somewhere between 70 and 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and this is in line with what the recommendations are actually seeing, and we do indeed see a dose-response relationship. The problem with their reasoning again is that yes, the dose response kind of fails once we go at a really high with high intensity with high intakes, because we have an absorption limitation that we simply do not kind of see here, and absorption limitation poses the problems with GI issues, poses other kind of perceptual mechanisms that could potentially negatively affect fatigue, and also we need to be thinking about what type or when the actually supply of carbohydrate is limited. We do not have data available from like 5, 6, 7 hour performance studies with high intensities. So I think it's again like very, very speculative of them, and I don't think the evidence that they cite or try to portray does not reflect actual evidence that is out there, because clearly there is evidence that carbohydrates do indeed improve performance, and there is to a certain extent a dose-response relationship.
And it'd be interesting on your point there as well. Hold my hands up. I haven't been through the the references in here, and in relation to that comment, were some of these happening before glucose and fructose was combined, and like you say, that limitation of transportation of glucose at the time, was it just glucose ingestion that then didn't show a change in response, or has this been shown across more modern approaches with glucose and fructose ratios? And like you say, there appears to be supporting evidence that there is a performance outcome based on that.
I mean, they actually mention those studies. For example, Smith 2013, they had they demonstrate a curvilinear relationship between performance and the carbohydrate intake. So kind of disproving their point. But then they have an outcome, like there is a table in the article, and it says authors propose curvilinear increase in exercise performance with increasing carbohydrate ingestion. Curvilinear increase emphasized by reducing scale of y-axis. Compare figures 1 and 2 in original papers. So like completely ignoring the statistical analysis, but just like their own interpretation of the data by just looking at the figure without having any like real objections on the methodology of the paper or statistical analysis, just like making it up why this particular paper is flawed. And I think this is the same for any other study that would show the results that are opposite of what they are trying to say. So yeah, it's kind of cherry picking how you interpret the data, which is not the way it should be done. And it should be picked by reviewers, which clearly hasn't been. And this is a bit of a problem in this instance.
Okay. So on to point 8 before we'll group point 9 and 10 together. So point 8, the novel replacement hypothesis has produced expert guidelines encouraging athletes to ingest up to 2 grams of carbohydrates per minute during prolonged exercise to prevent the depletion of the large glucose pool. So muscle glucose, muscle glycogen. Logically, these guidelines are also promoted to athletes participating in exercise lasting more than 3 hours. Yet prolonged strenuous exercise, example ultramarathon races, are often completed at exercise intensities between 60 to 75% VO2 max, at which intensities fat oxidation should be able to provide a substantial proportion of required energy, especially as rates of fat oxidation increase with progressive muscle glycogen depletion.
I think this one is like a bit stupid, and I think we already briefly discussed it in the introduction. Basically, yes, on average, the exercise intensity is such, but when you look at the specific segments of each race, be it trail running, be it cycling, be it triathlon, you would see that the intensity would not be constant and would be up and down. And this is when simply their theory does not hold true. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we know that, you know, people even like you say, it's a generalist view there, and it's assuming steady state, but we know trail races and, like you say, and bike races and that kind of stuff have variable nature. But also people are working a bit harder than that at some of these now as well. You know, we've seen performance improvements over the past, you know, 5-10 years go up, and the rate that they are, you know, working is pretty high. So, yeah, okay. Onto the next two. So 9 and 10, we're going to group together around sparing of muscle glycogen. So muscle glycogen is not spared during prolonged exercise, as would be expected if the large glucose pool, muscle glycogen, is the cardinal driver of exercise performance. Instead, the rate of muscle glycogen use during exercise is set by the muscle glycogen concentration at the start of exercise. Paradoxically, high rates of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise increase muscle glycogenolysis. Point 10. This is because high rates of carbohydrate ingestion or infusion during exercise reduce rates of fat oxidation. This would explain the increased rates of muscle glycogenolysis with high rates of carbohydrate ingestion or infusion during exercise. In effect, muscle glycogen determines its rate during exercise by setting the rate at which the major alternative fuel, fat, is oxidized. This effect appears to be hormonally regulated.
So number 9, there is no glycogen sparing. Muscle glycogen sparing. If you asked me like 2 months ago, I would say yes, I agree. There is no muscle glycogen sparing. However, there is more recent evidence that there has been a meta-analysis published looking at all the studies out there, and they actually demonstrate that when you have a really large sample size, so going beyond of what we see in general articles, you actually see muscle glycogen sparing, especially in running. There is no dose-response relationship demonstrated presently, but there is small, but in elite sport, perhaps significant glycogen sparing effect. It's small, but it is there, so it completely goes against what they are claiming. And when they're talking about super high intakes accelerating glycogen use, yes, that is true. That's what we are seeing in the lab, that if you go too high, you accelerate glycogen use. The question is whether this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. When we're talking about middle distance running or up to probably marathon running, this can be a good thing because the oxygen cost of using carbohydrates is lower than for fats. So you get more performance out of using more carbohydrates. You can gain a few seconds probably out there doing that during more prolonged exercise. This is something that is still debatable, whether we really need to go, for instance, beyond 90 grams per hour, but below 90 grams per hour, we definitely do not see this accelerated use of glycogen. So again, going against what they are saying, the mechanism of why we see accelerated use of glycogen is not particularly clear at the moment. It's very hypothetical at the moment, only demonstrated in a few studies. So I think they're making conclusions prematurely, but clearly we know that, again, glycogen sparing does occur, and at 90 grams per hour, we do not have accelerated use of muscle glycogen as they are saying. So again, I think their claims are incorrect.
Okay, point 11. In contrast, carbohydrate ingestion during exercise reduces or, at high rates of intake, completely suppresses liver glycogenolysis. This effect is the result of control mechanisms aimed at maintaining a stable blood glucose concentration, which is considered the principal aim of human metabolism.
Yes, carbohydrate ingestion during exercise mainly suppresses liver glycogen output. We know that for 2 hour long exercise, we can finish exercise with the same amount of liver glycogen if you're eating, let's say, 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But we know that after around 3 hours of exercise, we start relying more and more on digested carbohydrates or blood glucose. And that means is after 3 hours or anything that is longer than that, we need additional supply of carbohydrates because the glucose uptake from the bloodstream by the muscles exceeds of what we can actually supply by the ingested carbohydrates if we are eating at, like, let's say 90 grams per hour. So we are going into the stores of liver glycogen, and at some point we will need to also start the gluconeogenesis, so start breaking down the proteins and start breaking down the tissue that could actually usually not be used for energy provision, or we would see hypoglycemia occurring. So in other words, the body will try to protect blood glucose concentrations. The demands for glucose are way higher than what we think or what they are trying to portray, suppressing liver glycogen is not infinite. It only lasts for around 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours perhaps.
Okay, so point 12. During prolonged exercise, whole body carbohydrate oxidation decreases while blood glucose oxidation progressively increases regardless of intensity. Consequentially, exercise-induced hypoglycemia is probable without carbohydrate intake, particularly when starting with low liver glycogen and limited hepatic gluconeogenesis capacity. We might want to explain some of those terms to the listeners, gluconeogenesis, there just so that they understand the context.
Gluconeogenesis is basically creation of new glucose molecules. So yes, this point stands. Especially low liver glycogen would then mean that we would eventually get hypoglycemic and we would need to terminate exercise because of occurrence of hypoglycemia.
And I think that's something that we know anyway. If we can't supply the primary supply of blood glucose to the blood, if that's low, then we're not going to be able to provide for very long without doing something about it. Point 13, falling liver glycogen concentrations stimulate adipose tissue lipolysis, so the breakdown of lipids for fuel, increasing muscle fat oxidation, further sparing both blood glucose and muscle glycogen use. Yeah,
I think it's a bit of, you just said in the point 12, if you read it.
It's a statement.
Yeah, it says, while blood glucose oxidation progressively increases regardless of intensity. And then in point 13, we suddenly have increasing muscle fat oxidation, further sparing both blood glucose and muscle glycogen use. So we still get an increase in blood glucose oxidation, and fat does not counteract that to the amount that we would basically have a stable use of blood glucose, or actually reduce blood glucose concentration. So clearly fat is not sufficient by the logic of what they just said in point 12. So I think we have a bit of a issue with their reasoning here again.
Okay, so we're nearly at the end of 16 points, so we hope you're still with us. So point 14, rats that overexpress the protein targeted to glycogen have elevated liver glycogen content at rest and during both exercise and fasting. They also have greater resistance to exercise-induced hypoglycemia and superior exercise performance. Rats with greater capacity to store muscle glycogen do not have superior exercise performance, nor do rats unable to synthesize muscle glycogen have impaired exercise performance. The authors conclude that these results identify hepatic glucose as a key regulator of endurance performance in mice, an effect that may be exerted by the maintenance of blood glucose concentrations. Back to the blood glucose concentration argument
yes,
again.
it's important. We know it, and it's undisputed. And rats probably did not do a cycling race with undulating exercise intensity. They were just like turning the wheel or whatever they're doing, and definitely at moderate intensity. So yes, blood glucose concentration is important, and this is cherry picking the evidence from mice. And we have also probably some other evidence suggesting that muscle contraction does not happen if we do not have glycogen. But of course, we ignored that evidence in this article.
And perhaps they didn't have the opportunity to have a nice bottle of Nduranz 90 drink there on the side that they can just, take some of that and continue their exercise performance. Sorry. Back to around the maintenance of blood glucose concentration. Point 15, recent studies established that athletes chronically adapted to low carbohydrate diets achieve highest rates of fat oxidation yet measured in humans, so around 1.5 grams per minute, even when exercising at more than 85% of their VO2 max. This challenges the existence of exercise crossover point, which holds that carbohydrate oxidation increases and fat oxidation decreases with increasing exercise intensity, so that above approximately 85% VO2 max, only carbohydrate is oxidized. Rather, this finding suggests that fat oxidation fuels exercise even during high-intensity exercise. This in turn challenges the concept that carbohydrate is an obligatory fuel for both high-intensity and prolonged exercise. So just a quick point on that, the crossover point, if you increased exercise intensity, you would naturally see a point where fat oxidation rates start to decline and carbohydrate oxidations increase. Would you say that's usually around 65-70% VO2 max? It's variable individual.
Who cares about the crossover point? I think the main point here is that even if we have fat oxidation rates at 1.5 grams per minute, to be able to push the numbers that today Pogacar pushes up the climb, which is talking probably around 450 watts, that would not be enough to fuel the performance. I think that's the main point here. Like fat on its own, if we have highly fat adapted person or not, would not be able to go at the level required to win professional endurance events without the requirement of using carbohydrates. And that's kind of the main problem with this statement. And 1.5 grams per hour is simply not enough. We see these numbers like when go with athletes at around 300 watts, 1 gram per minute, at the same time with 3 grams per minute of carbohydrates. So perhaps, you still need loads of carbohydrates. Even if you had fat oxidation rates of 1.5 grams per minute, you still need carbohydrates to go at 450 watts or whatever the exercise intensity is.
And I think there's points there. If you have high fat, low carbohydrate, you do see increases in fat oxidation. But there's also some nice real world studies out there. Louise Burke did the study with race walkers and low carb diets, and it goes back to that point of what is the measure of performance. And like you say with Pogacar, yeah, he might be able to exercise at 85% VO2 max, but will he be able to do that final climb at the same that he does now on a low carbohydrate diet? Is part of the question. And we are finally at point 16. So a recent study found that the performance of athletes habituated for 6 weeks to either high carbohydrate, which is 380 grams per day, or low carbohydrate of 40 grams per day, was not different during prolonged submaximal exercise, despite low carbohydrate diet having lower glycogen and carbohydrate oxidation levels. However, ingesting 10 grams of carbohydrate per hour during exercise increased exercise performance by 12% to 20%. Sorry, by 12% to 20%, while eliminating exercise-induced hypoglycemia. As glycogen and whole body carbohydrate were lower on a low carbohydrate diet across multiple analyses, yet performance was maintained. This directly challenges glycogen and whole body carbohydrate oxidation and instead suggests that exercise-induced hypoglycemia is a central determinant of exercise performance.
So we have 602 studies being cited in this review article, all dealing with carbohydrates one way or another. And then we come to the last point, which is one single study done by Professor Tim Noakes and his colleagues, published I think last year or 2 years ago, saying 10 grams per hour improves performance, and that is sufficient evidence to suggest that 10 grams per hour is enough, ignoring all the other 601 studies probably that show pretty much otherwise. And now we start relying on one single study that they designed to prove their point, probably, with a lot of methodological flaws, which I'm going not to go into at the present, in today's podcast. But it just, they talk about the how much evidence we need, how we need to kind of demonstrate, improve things, and then they produce one single study, and the whole article concludes on the conclusions on one single study that they actually designed and they have undertaken, and has a lot of methodological flaws from my perspective. So I don't know, I'm just lost for words at this point. What else do we say? We are completely ignoring the effect of the recovery. We are completely ignoring the energy balance. The fact that athletes are struggling to meet the energy balance, and if we are making them meet 10 grams per hour during, 5, 6 hours, 7, 8 hour long events, where are we going to get the energy balance for the rest of the day to actually meet the demands of the next day? Not talking about gluconeogenesis, muscle protein breakdown, relative energy deficiency, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's just we can go on and go, for a long time. So we clearly even see in their reasoning, they have problems with the accuracy, but their reasoning is point by point, telling a story rather than actually being a cohesive, a good review of the literature with downsides or limitations to their thinking. And I'm just, I think that's kind of what I have to say. And I think we hopefully have uncovered the limitations, the flaws of the thinking. I think it's a good thing that we get challenged and we reset our thinking and say, okay, perhaps we are wrong, but I don't think this article actually does the case. I think it supports the argument that actually carbohydrates are important, because they've done a good job reviewing 600 articles, and I think looking at the literature provided, it still points towards carbohydrates being important. So that's my take on it.
And I think, from a top level, is it a generalist view? Is it a reductionist view on what message they're trying to send? Because we've highlighted many times in this podcast what different ways performance might occur, and is this a recreational athlete that does a short amount of 30-45 minute run a day, what is endurance and physical performance in all of this? Then maybe you can get away with 10 grams in one particular instance or context. But I think what we've conveyed here is that if we are thinking about what we perceive as endurance performance and bike racing and running and those types of events that are for extended durations, then some of it starts to come unstuck a little bit. So 10 grams an hour, Tim?
Yes, from tomorrow onwards.
Yeah, I might not be able to make it through the day. So that's going to round up our review on this piece of research. And the reason why we want to do it as well is because you, the listeners out there, the evolution of social media and things like this does make nutrition a real hard world to try and depict what is right, what is wrong. There are lots of different narratives. There's lots of different experts that are out there, and even the experts that you see in, research paper like this, again, there's a tendency to take that as gospel, where actually we need to be a bit critical and try and understand and try and convey some of that message to the general public out there. So that was the reason why we wanted to go into a bit more depth of this and pick out some of those key points that they were trying to make, so that you, the listeners, can maybe understand it a little bit better and perhaps not go down to 10 grams an hour whilst you're doing your 4 or 5 hour race. Who knows? But we hope that you have enjoyed this deep dive. We've enjoyed digging into some of this science, and we hope to bring you some more types of this podcast as publications and important research come out as well. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon. Ciao.